Alright, so naturally, we had one of these planned for today.
Yeah.
But then, because we're recording this now, which is Friday, it was yesterday that news broke that a massive loss to the Hollywood community had happened. Like, I don't know if like how many normal moviegoers know him by name, but you absolutely know his resume. It's almost even from here on the other side of the country, you could like feel the emotional vibration that was happening in Hollywood. I'm of course talking about the director Mike Nichols, who has an endless filmography of legendary and beloved movies. So naturally, I thought, well, I kind of had to scramble because I was thinking, this was abruptly yesterday, so I had to come up with something quickly. I decided that with his filmography, there had to have been something to do with this.
Yeah.
So, because if we did like a Hoffman type tribute video, I could do this all day. I did have something that I wanted to do with Virginia Woolf, but I couldn't obtain the other movie. But then I remembered, we can go kind of into his lesser known territory of his filmography. Because, he's got like The Graduate and Working Girl and Silkwood and Postcards from the Edge, and his later ones like Closer and Charlie Wilson's War, and so many others it's just hard to comprehend all of them. He also got a lot of love for Angels in America, the miniseries he did with Pacino. So I decided to go with his World War II movies, which take two totally different approaches to it, but nevertheless are still in the same genre and both have his name on them. The movie I had against Virginia Woolf isn't a Nichols movie, so this one feels more appropriate doing both with his name on them.
That one will happen eventually, but not right now.
So, I think we're going to start with Biloxi Blues, which I was just telling you, I know this movie because it used to play on Comedy Central like all the time. That's actually how I first saw it. So, now, it's kind of like, it's a different war, obviously, but it's basically I feel like I'm explaining this to you because you said you've just got nothing on these two.
No.
Biloxi Blues is basically like a really much friendlier version of Full Metal Jacket.
Okay.
In a way. That's really, really simplifying it, but that's the vibe you would get. I'm sure it has a lot of comparisons to it, especially since it came out the year after, in '88. And we start, and Matthew Broderick's character, Eugene Jerome, because he's the most Jewish person of all Jewish people. No, that's actually his friend Epstein, looks an awful lot like Jerry Lewis, but we'll get to that in a minute. The movie starts and he's narrating and telling us this, and we kind of learn throughout the movie that Eugene Jerome actually is Neil Simon, the writer and playwright, obviously, who created this story. And apparently all of these things happened, with the exception of one, but that's a joke for later. So it starts with him on this train, and he's writing in a journal and about everything that he sees here, and this is apparently what became the play that became this movie. So he's on the train, and he's on his way to basically a boot camp type. And we meet all of the various colorful characters that we're going to know throughout this movie. And you've got like basically the two testosterone fueled guys that always give him a hard time and are always bullying Epstein and stuff like that. And while narrating, he has this really funny line where obviously they're at a time of war, and he's with these guys, and his line about these guys is, it's hard to believe that these guys actually have mothers and fathers that are worried about them. So they get to the boot camp, and naturally when you have a boot camp movie, there's one character that you really, really get drawn into, whether it be Arlie Ermey in Full Metal Jacket or Louis Gossett Jr. in An Officer and a Gentleman. That character is in this movie as well, played by Christopher Walken. I totally fucked up Christopher Walken's name there. That was weird. And Christopher Walken is Toomey, who is the... Well, the interesting thing about this character is when he's first introduced, like when he first walks onto the screen, he seems like not that bad of a guy. But as the movie progresses and goes further and further along, we realize that that is not the case whatsoever. And Toomey is actually borderline psychotic. You know, hence the casting of Christopher Walken, I guess.
Makes sense now.
And what's interesting about him is you would think he's kind of a weird choice. Because Walken can yell and everything, but that's not the kind of Walken we're getting here. Because despite the fact that he's psychotic and he's playing one of those characters, the character of Toomey is really quiet in his intimidation. Like, I don't even recall a scene where he does yell. It's just all really, you know, personal, straightforward intimidation. I always love that moment when they're in the cafeteria and he's basically asking for something, and the one guy basically just says, you know, what he thinks Toomey wants to hear, and Toomey's response to it is, "That's a good answer. A chicken shit one, but a good one." And it's just a really interesting character to watch. He's one of those characters where all the other characters in the movie are really likable and you can really, you know, grow attached to, but Toomey is one of those characters where when he's not there, you can always sense his presence. And that's not just because he'll just say things that happened where he wasn't even remotely on screen, and then he can just look at them and say, "Oh, I hear everything. I see everything." And you always, because of Walken's performance and because of how that character is developed, you can sense that always lurking that he's doing, even when he's not on screen. So it's a really good overlooked Walken performance when talking about his lineup of performances in his career. And then we, that's basically all it is. From then on, it's pretty episodic. It just goes from one place to another. Like we have, there's, obviously since it's based on a play and it's a Neil Simon script, naturally there's going to be really long scenes of characters just kind of talking, which really work in the context of this movie. And, you know, really work if you've got a great writer doing it. There's one where they play the fantasy game where they all throw money into the middle, and whoever comes up with the best fantasy gets all the money. And it's this really long scene where we learn and most of them always come back. The one thing that they want more than anything in the world. And one of which, for Broderick, is to lose his virginity. Where they go to, the actress's name is Park Overall, I think, who's really, really great here. She's basically this prostitute that they go to, and this eventually leads to probably the funniest scene of somebody losing their virginity that's ever been in a movie in the history of time. I can't describe it, you just kind of have to see exactly how this plays out. And Broderick's really great there also. And then there's that really, you know, emotional moment where they discover Jerome's journal and they're all reading the excerpts about themselves. Because he has, like, whole paragraphs devoted to each and every one of them and what he's taken down about them and how he feels about them, truthfully. And that's also good for kind of character development, too. There's a lot of... Those scenes really help as far as getting to know these characters and getting more attached to them. There's probably some complaints that some of them don't get fleshed out enough, but I think it's enough to the point to where you can... It's always good when you have a movie that has a lot of characters in it and you actually remember their names.
Oh, yeah.
That's usually a good sign. So, I thought all the characters were juggled pretty well. The one character that kind of stands out as... like, not unnecessary, but... her importance is blown a little out of proportion. As you can see from this DVD case, you see walking here in the dog tag, and then you see Penelope Ann Miller. Penelope Ann Miller's character, Daisy, that he meets at the dance over an hour into the movie. And he has a love at first sight with her. Now, you might get the wrong impression of what the movie's about, because what's this? The tagline is, "The Army gave him training. Daisy showed him the basics."
Sounds like a comedy.
The movie is a comedy.
Yeah.
But
that's just what it comes off right away. It just comes off like a comedy.
The thing about that is that Daisy is in this movie for like 2 minutes. And nothing becomes of them. They dance together at this dance, and he experiences love at first sight, which was one of the things on his fantasy list. And then we just abruptly learn in, like, voiceover, like, oh, by the way, she went off and married some dude, and they had 3 children, and everything's great. And he never saw Daisy again after that, like, 2 scenes he had with her. So if that's what you think looking at, like, you know, the advertisements or cover, it's not exactly that kind of movie. That could be for comedic purposes, I don't know. So, yes. What this movie proves, though, is that, if anything, Neil Simon, who's, you know, did, like, The Odd Couple and Seems Like Old Times and stuff like that, all those really, you know, wacky comedies that are great. Which, this isn't exactly one of those. This is more of like a, there's some heavy stuff in here too, particularly the scene where, Toomey, like, gets completely shit-faced and pulls out a gun and basically, like, could kill Jerome at any minute, and you actually believe that he could. But regardless of that, it shows that I think, Neil Simon and Mike Nichols were kind of a match made in heaven. And while this movie isn't exactly, you know, it doesn't reach the greatness of, like, you know, Neil Simon's best stuff or Nichols' best stuff. It is a really great representation of what they're both capable of, and I think this is one of those movies that kind of gets a little too overlooked. I don't know how many people are familiar with it, but I don't imagine that number's too big. Unless, like, maybe they saw it on Comedy Central like 5 times.
I've heard of it, but I've never seen it.
And yeah, I'm sure it's got, like, flack for being unoriginal because it does kind of hit all those basic, you know, boot camp points. Movies like Stripes and stuff like that. But, none of that really bothers me here because it handles the material so well. That's my opinion anyway. So, yeah, I think more people need to seek this out than have, so, yeah. Catch-22 is pretty different. Catch-22 is a full-on black comedy. Catch-22 is such a black comedy that it almost goes into full-on drama. Well, actually, yeah, you could argue that it does. But let me throw out a disclaimer about Catch-22 before I say anything else real quick. It's my understanding that Catch-22 is based off an extremely beloved book with a very, very dedicated fan base. And I guess the book and this movie don't see eye to eye. That's to my understanding from the research that I've done. So I will go ahead and tell you now that this is strictly about the movie, and I have never once laid eyes on the book. This is just all, as you've seen, it's movies that I do, not any other medium. So keep that in mind if you're one of those people that came to this video. For that, you might want to look elsewhere. This is strictly about the movie itself. I have nothing else to base my opinion of this story on. Now that that is out of the way, we start off, and we already know that this is going to be not your normal comedy because the movie is bookended. When I say bookended, I mean it shows something and then we circle back around to it. Alan Arkin's character being stabbed in the back. And I guess we're not totally sure if he makes it or not. Obviously we know at the end that he did, but when you first see it, that's pretty attention grabbing.
Yeah.
Now the main story is there's a lot going on in this movie, like to a fault, but let's go slowly. The main story is Alan Arkin's character, who is trying desperately to get out of the war. He's he does not want to fly missions anymore. So he's doing everything in his power to try to convince everybody that he's insane so he'll be discharged. He wants everybody to think he's just a complete lunatic. And the movie is basically the various ways he goes about this. And it's kind of like... It gives you a lot of, like, the feel of, say, a really, really dark edge put into MASH or Hogan's Heroes. That's kind of what it comes off as. But, as I was saying before, it does kind of... You could look at it one of two ways, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you now, I've seen Catch-22 a couple of times. I even own it on DVD, as you can see. But, I still am not quite sure how to register this movie. Because there's a way to look at it to where you can say, you know, positive things, but then there's another way you can look at it, and maybe not so much, but I still have not quite figured out, you know, my thoughts on it. But here's how we're going to kind of try to work that out. There's an obvious shift in the middle, where obviously from the get-go, it's a World War II movie that's a black comedy. So, and it begins with a stabbing. So chances are it's gonna get really, really dark. Maybe past the comedy point. However, okay. The two ways you can look at it are, the approach here is either, you know, we're seeing the funny side to it, and then we're setting the funny side to it aside and seeing the really, you know, gruesome consequences of what we initially found funny about the whole thing. Or you can say, you know, maybe it's, I don't know. Well, the thing about that is how the ending kind of brings back the kind of a dark comedy feel to it. You could very easily say the tone is really uneven. How, like I said, it's almost practically a parody for the first hour or so. But then, I think the off-putting thing about the tonal shift is not just the tone, but it gets gruesome. There are exposed intestine in this movie. And there's a particular scene. This scene is where it kind of... I'm still not quite sure how to handle exactly what this movie's doing in tone. Is the scene with Hungry Joe. There's a moment where they're on the beach, and you know those little things that are kind of like out in the middle of the ocean and stuff, like those wooden things that you're kind of like a platform that you can stand on.
Yeah.
And this guy Hungry Joe is out there with some binoculars, and there's this disgruntled pilot that's flying around in this small plane. There's ones with like the propeller in the front. And he's flying around, and Hungry Joe is like the photographer, and he's trying to get pictures of it. And then, at that moment, while they're witnessing this, the plane flies down and cuts Hungry Joe in half along the waist. And from the waist down, his legs are just standing there while a geyser of blood is coming out of him. And then he just kind of falls into the water.
Wow.
And then the plane crashes into a mountain and explodes, killing that guy too. And that's, at that point, is kind of where it goes into the dark, gruesome territory, but the way that scene is handled is a bit confusing. Because of how they react watching this on the beach. Because I think it's supposed to be a darkly funny scene, because they practically have no reaction to witnessing this. So they're like, oh, well, there went Hungry Joe, and then the plane just explodes on the side of a mountain. Now, yes, I could totally buy that as a darkly funny scene, the way they just don't react to it. But it's the fact that the movie kind of goes with that for the rest of the time, after having been this, you know, war movie parody for the first half. It's... I'm still quite confused exactly what tone they want to go for. Because there are, because the comedy in the first half is really broad. It's not exactly subtle by any means. I mean, there's like, there's things in there, but for the most part, like the moments with what I think is one of the funniest moments in the movie is there is this colonel, I think, I'm not positive on the rank, that's Orson Welles. And he's there, and they're all lined up, and they're all doing their thing. And then Arkin, trying to prove to him that he's insane, walks up to him fully nude. And it's this very, very long shot. And I don't know if this was Nichols' direction, or if this was Welles, or what it was. But from the moment Arkin approaches him, and then Welles just stares at Alan Arkin's naked body, this stare lasts for a very, very long time before Welles finally says something. And it's a really great scene as far as comedic timing, because he stands there and looks for a long time. And you can kind of see everybody else trying to like stifle laughter. I think half of it was in character, half of it wasn't. So there's that. It's also, while we're on the subject of nudity, I guess it's also worth noting that Paula Prentice has a full frontal nude scene in this movie, and the reason I mention that is because apparently this movie, I don't know if the statistic is fully true or not, but from what I've read and heard, this is the first movie to feature full frontal nudity and be like an actual movie with like an actual wide release. So that's an interesting fun fact this year, playing worthless trivia with somebody. Now, one of the big things to watch with this movie is not all of them were names by this point, but a lot of them were. But even so, they became names if they weren't already. The cast list for this movie is out of this world. Like, it is unbelievable. I mentioned Alan Arkin's our star. We have Orson Welles. There's Martin Balsam. There's Jon Voight. There's Martin Sheen. Bob Newhart. Anthony Perkins, Charles Grodin, Art Garfunkel, an unrecognizably young Bob Balaban.
Nice.
There's some I'm even forgetting that I'm going to remember later and kick myself for, but yes. And they all have like substantial roles too. It's not like Gary Cooper in Wings, where you say like, oh hey, that guy in the background became somebody. All of these people have, like, camera time and lines. And it's remarkable. But the trouble with that is that there's a lot of characters to juggle. And those kind of seem oddly split up. And some of them feel a bit pointless. I mean, obviously we have Garfunkel's a really important character because we have the... I think we're supposed to assume that it's the prostitute that he's with is the one that ended up stabbing Arkin. Which is this whole story. And yeah, from what I've read, I have heard that there's apparently a lot of subtle things in this movie that only book readers will understand, which is a little off-putting from a moviegoer's perspective. But, I guess that kind of makes me a hypocrite because when I'm the book reader in a scenario, I'm usually the same way. So, it's just like where I can confess this right now, I pretty much like Gone Girl on principle. Because I had read the book beforehand. But regardless, so yeah, Catch-22 is one of those movies that I've always really, really wanted to like, and I'm thinking, if I view it enough, maybe I can get to that point. Because I feel like there's something in here that I can love, but the past couple of times I've watched it, I have trouble with it, but I guess we can see what happens. So having said that, of these two, I prefer Biloxi Blues by quite a bit, but I'm curious to see how I feel about Catch-22 in like maybe 10 years' time or something. So, yes. Perhaps reading the book will help, but...
Potentially.
Who has time for that?
So, that is Versus for this week, and next week, Versus will be combined with a movie that's actually coming out next week. So, also stay tuned to the segments on Pop, wrestling content, Sip and Snack, Vlog of Randomness, everything here, and back to AJ's movie reviews next week. Birdman, Whiplash, Penguins of Madagascar, and Horrible Bosses 2. I may or may not have said what the verses might be in our last sentence. So,
well, it could be one of two things.
Exactly.
Dissect that.
Any parting words?
Mike Nichols was legendary, and his fantastic, gigantic filmography will be immortal and beloved and cherished for as long as movies are in existence, which will probably be forever. And
this is not the last time you'll see or hear from Mike Nichols on Versus. Yes. Mark my words.
Yes.